Welcome back to Relevant History. Today we're continuing our What is History series, so if you haven't seen the first video, I definitely recommend you go watch it. Other than that, let's begin. In my last video, I talked about the what part of history and came up for a definition for the word history itself. Based on that definition, I'm gonna come up with the next question, which is the who. Who are the historians that write history, and who do they write about? Ever since the writings of Herodotus and Thucydides, history seems to be written mostly like Thucydides wrote it, a history focused on war, politics, and those famous people who usually live at the top of society. I mean, it makes sense since history written this way would definitely benefit those rulers and the government. I mean, why would they want to adopt Herodotus' approach of writing about the common, irrelevant people, even though they're literally like 99% of the world's population? As you can see, history that's written this way, and I'm looking at you, Leopold von Ranke, can be a little bit problematic to say the least. Writing history like this, which is basically history written by the victors, essentially leaves out minorities or unpopular opinions out of history. But that's not always the case. For example, during the Crusades, you usually try to learn about them from either the Christian or the Muslim perspective. But there's actually a third perspective, which is that of the Jews, because there was a few records, mostly anonymous, about how the Jews experienced the Crusades. So thanks to someone who we don't know who it was and was probably not even a historian themselves, we know that there was a persecution of Jews during the Crusades. It gives us a new perspective into the Crusades. This pretty much all ties up to the big idea of this video, which is that not only do obviously historians write history themselves, but people themselves also can influence who is history going to be written about. So yes, historians sometimes have ties to governments or elites, and that's why they tend to write histories favored to them. But at the end of the day, a lot of the histories, facts, events, accounts were written by just regular day people, journalists, people who wrote in the diaries. These are pretty much what we call primary sources, and they're pretty much the most essential thing that a historian needs to write a historical account. So although the historians might put history together into a particular way, they have to get all that information out of original regular people, common people, and that's where we as people can actually play a role into what history will become. So we just established that classical historians wrote one-sided histories, and that primary sources, although biased, could bring other perspectives on what happened. The first major academic group to embrace this and actually go against the classical top political history format was the French Annales School, promoted by prominent historians like Marc Bloch, Lucien Freire, Fernand Braudel, and others. This school of history focused on looking at social and economic structures to create a very broad explanation of history. No individuals, no specific events. Just a deep analysis of the overall systems that stay in place and adapt over huge geographic expanses and timescales. The best analogy I could provide is that if historians were scientists studying space, the classical historians would be the astronomers studying individual planets or stars, while the Annales school would be the cosmologists studying the entire universe as a whole. So you have in one side the old school classical historians, and in the other you have the Annales historians, and they're competing to see who's going to be the one writing history based on how they think it's the most truthful or best way to write it. Now, who do you think won? Well, none of them, of course. Well, you didn't expect that? Well, neither did they expect the rise of postmodernism. You see, Annales historians were not the only group of academics who were questioning the classical idea of an absolute truth, and not just restricted to history itself. The postmodernists were one of these groups, and they are the ones that basically took this idea of relativism and pretty much just shot it through the roof. When I say separate group, I mean that they have a very different academic background. Seriously, every prominent postmodernist ever literally has something to do with literary criticism. So as postmodernism began to get more popular, its proponents tried to see how they could influence how history was being written with postmodernist ideals. A good way to see how this happened is by looking at Hayden White's book, Metahistory. First, postmodernists looked at what historians have written already, and they began to point out that historians were not actually writing an account of what happened in the past, but they were actually writing their own biased interpretation of past events. This is essentially giving a punch to the idea of historical narrative and the truth that it carries. No. The second argument is that postmodernists don't think that historical narrative is truthful because, as we already mentioned, they see that there's some bias or at least one-sidedness in previous histories. So that means that for them, historical narrative is pretty much the same thing as the narrative used for a fictitious story. No. The third and last argument is that even though history and fiction are obviously different because history deals with real past events, postmodernists say that the fact that the two have very similar narratives means that history can only quote-unquote be represented in an imaginary way. No! Yeah, I talked about Carlo Ginzburg already and how he opposed this relative skepticism since in the wrong hands, it can literally be used to do some very bad things like deny the Holocaust. But honestly, in the grand scheme of things, postmodernism did not end up taking over the history field. First, you got historians like Ginzburg who outright rejected postmodernism. You then got historians who were influenced by postmodernism, including Hayden White, but they didn't apply everything postmodernism had. Then you have historians in the middle ground, such as this trio. Together, Joyce Appleby, Lynn Hunt, and Margaret Jacob wrote Telling the Truth About History. It's a pretty complex book, but the main idea is that it's trying to find the perfect compromise between postmodernist ideas that are valid to history and then merging those with traditional historiography. You might be wondering, why do I talk so much about this postmodernism and relativism? I haven't even directly answered the question of who writes our history textbooks. The reason why I did that was because relativism and postmodernism reminded historians that there are other perspectives around that are worth exploring. For example, the trio that wrote Telling the Truth About History definitely cited postmodernism's push for better representation of women and minorities in history as a good thing. That's why, thanks to this consideration, the 1950s onward saw more historians looking at previously ignored histories or groups of people and finally coming out and telling their stories. Let me just give you a few examples about that. So first we have African American history and the efforts of historians to prove that this is indeed part of American history. A good example is John Hope Franklin's book From Slavery to Freedom, which tells the history of the U.S. Civil War, but based on the actions of African Americans. You also have Stephanie Camp, who wrote an essay on the leisure life of slave women. Not only is this another example of African American history, but it's also part of women's history. Another honorable mention is George Chauncey's book, Gay New York, which explores the previously ignored history of New York's male gay community. But the bringing of previously ignored perspectives is not something unique to the United States. In Mexico, for example, you have historian Miguel León-Portilla, who wrote The Broken Spears, which is a book that gives us the indigenous perspective of the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire. The recalling of minority perspectives in the histories of Africa, India, and Southeast Asia are also some really good examples which, although I won't go into the specifics, are definitely worth mentioning. Now this is the part where I give you an upfront answer to the who question, but first let's recap. We established that the writing of history depends on historians and the people that they decide to write about. At first, historians mostly focused on famous and political individuals that make up the upper parts of society. Also, because historians have their own views, ideologies, and motivations, they are bound to be biased when it comes to deciding who do they want to write about. The Knowledge School acknowledges this bias, and that's why they decide to go from focusing on politics and individuals to economics and society. At the same time, you also have postmodernism trying to pretty much take over the history field with radical skepticism and relativism. Although most historians found postmodernism problematic and rejected it, it nevertheless was influential because it made historians reconsider who have they not represented properly in the past. A spy! So if someone were to ask me, who writes our history today? I would answer that it's historians who take into account classical, annales, and postmodernist knowledge to write meaningful histories that are as close to the truth as possible. I also want to remind you that there's more to who writes history than historians. If there's something that you would all have to take away from this video, it's that we ordinary people also play a role into how history is written. Because what we do, what we say, what we record, it all becomes the sources in the future that historians will use to write the history of our times. And in that sense, we're not only making history, but we're also writing it. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned and you also enjoyed. See you in the next video.